On Sundays before I go to Mass, I would go for a walk. There's a pretty little trail near where I lived. So I would walk and pray my rosary. I was actually dedicating my rosary every day to my future wife. I wanted to get married, and I wanted to ask Our Lady to really intercede, and to help me in this process to find the one that God intended for me to marry. I was raised Lutheran. I remember going to church. It wasn't like something I really loved doing, but as I got older, when I started seeking God and thinking about, eternal things and, the reality of eternity and, what happens after death. Started researching more and trying to find God. Now, Catholics at this point were kind of for me, I always saw them as kind of wrong, there was always kind of a stigma around it, they got it wrong and they do all this other, stuff that's not what the Bible calls for, I actually, my first real experience with the Mass, besides going to funerals as a child, was actually live stream Masses during COVID. I would watch the Masses online, I learned about the Mass and more about, the church and, its apostolic origins and how it was different than Lutheranism, and learning about the early church's, reverence for Mary. This is true, this is right, and why don't we talk about Mary anymore in the Lutheran Church? So I didn't have a rosary, so I just prayed using my fingers, and eventually I bought one. And ever since that conversion, I prayed the rosary every single day. This is after COVID now, so post-COVID, I was okay, there's Masses being said in person. So I said, I'm just gonna go to Mass Sunday. So I went to 7:30 Sunday Mass, and it was great. I really liked it, and I kept going to Mass. I was going to this one particular church, pretty regularly, and one of the priests actually came up to me after Mass. I think it was a Saturday night vigil Mass. Introduced himself and asked why I didn't receive communion. He was like, I recognize I've seen you here, I talked about my process of conversion, learning about the faith, and he offered to sit down and talk with me. And that's how it kind of started. Finally, after a few times of talking with him, committed to, I want to become Catholic. How do we do this, My family was supportive, and they attended my confirmation, First Holy Communion. And they were interested, but not in the sense of I want to become Catholic too, let's do this. So my younger sister Kate, along the same time though, she was interested. She was actually, along her own, conversion process and journey. And then the following year, she came into their church as well. So my mom and dad were still Lutheran at this time, but actually, the following Easter Vigil, my parents, my mom and dad, both came into the church as well.
In my upbringing, my parents, they would do the family rosary every day. They thought that it was crucial to family life. They would always say a family that prays together stays together. It was so important for me, I think, because that gave me the foundation of what I wanted to do for my future children someday. So I started saying a personal daily rosary on May 13th of 2017, which is the 100th anniversary of Our Lady of Fatima. I always had the inspiration that I was supposed to get married. And, I started looking around and I was like, well, let's make this happen. I had plans and everything, and I had trouble figuring out what was God's will, what was mine. I eventually got engaged, but long story short, it wasn't God's will that I stay with him. It was a difficult thing, but it was not what God intended for me to stay with. However, it was very important actually in launching me forward in my spiritual life. Taking off an engagement ring, that it messes up with your psychology. You've been wearing something for a while and now you're not. I needed a new thing on my finger. So I had a ring. It's like a fidget ring that my parents got me from Merciful Savior. It said, Jesus, I trust in you. So I put that on and I wore it for 6 months. It was just a constant reminder that God's in control and not me. And good thing I'm not, because I'm gonna mess it all up. I felt like I was being called to go to church daily and everything, whether it was adoration or mass or something. I'm not very good at mornings. So I was like, okay, I'm gonna try it one time. I went and I felt there were signs that God wanted me to stay there and keep on going. And I was like, oh boy, this is gonna be interesting, because it's like I had no faith in myself waking up early and everything. So I'm like, okay, well, Lord, I know you're giving me this, so you're gonna help me with this. I'm gonna do my best. You're gonna take the rest. Okay. At one of the masses that I would go to, there was a mother who would come in with her daughter, and the daughter was wearing a veil. So I went up to her and I said, hey, you wear a veil and I wear a veil, and I think that we should be friends. I said, hi, I'm Bernadette, and she said, hi, I'm Kate. So Kate is actually Dan's sister. Her mother was actually Dan's mother too. So she came up and she also said, and I'm Allie, nice to meet you.
So prior to actually meeting Bernadette, going around from different masses like I was doing, I would notice this distinctly purple car sometimes at masses, and I kind of put it together as a pretty girl who drives it, wears a veil and everything. And my mom starts talking about going to daily mass and running into this girl after mass, and somehow I put it together as the same girl.
I feel like when she did start telling me about Dan, she continually started telling me about Dan. I was intrigued to meet him, actually, from what his mother was saying, because he converted his family, or at least several members of his family, and it's not usual to hear that. So I was like, okay, I actually do want to have a conversation with this person, even though I'm nervous too.
I'd like to meet her. She's pretty and seems very reverent and God-fearing, and that stuff that I was very interested in. That's what I want in a wife. So I would see her at mass. My mom was telling me about her. I was like, okay, eventually I'm gonna meet this girl.
I had been seeing him sometimes come to church with his mom, got acquainted with the back of his head. And so he'd be leaving church, and I would go like this.
Well, we usually didn't walk at the same time. Usually she would stay and pray or something, and I would take off to go to work or whatever.
So there was one day I actually had to leave immediately after Mass too. I had plans with my sister. So I was like, oh man, he also leaves immediately after Mass. I'm gonna leave more immediately than he does. So, the final blessing ends. I do, some prayers really quick, just for a minute. And then I get up and I go. And I was so proud of myself. I'm like walking. Well, because I wasn't sure that that's what God wanted me to do, was meet him. So I'm like, okay, God, I don't want to even make eye contact with somebody that you don't want me to make eye contact with. I'm booking it out of here. And then I'm so happy that I think I'm doing God's will, and I make it to the vestibule, and then I'm like, I forgot my keys. And by that time I see him scooching out of his pew, genuflecting, like he didn't see that I was just all the way in the back. I go and I get my keys, and by that time we're both turning around. It just looks like I'm leaving the pew. And he has a longer stride than I do, so he quickly catches up to me. And then when we make it to the vestibule, I turn around and say, so you must be Dan. And he said, and you must be Bernadette. I've heard only good things about you.
It was pretty awkward, to be honest. She shook my hand, and it was a business handshake. It wasn't like oh yeah, I can't wait to meet this guy, and no, it was pretty formal. And I remember leaving, I was like, I was actually driving for work that day, and I was thinking to myself, like, man, I kind of blew that one, I just figured I was, have some kind of pickup line. I didn't. It was just awkward. But I do remember recollecting as I was driving, remembering this is the Feast of Sacred Heart of Jesus, and I was like, that'd be pretty cool, if this does go somewhere, interesting day that God put it on.
Eight days later, so it was on a Saturday, he asked me out after church. We were walking out, and we got in a little bit of conversation, a little bit about his conversion, a little bit about where he was living at the moment, just stuff like that. And he's like, hey, you seem like a pretty cool person. I'd like to take you on a date sometime. So I said, okay. I was nervous, and I was listening to music and everything, and I was just watching the clock. He pulls up, and he gets out. My dad greets him at the door, shakes his hand and everything. He comes up, he picked me flowers, actually, and he took me to a traditional Latin mass and then out to lunch. So it was a lovely first date.
Very early on, I I was very confident I would marry Bernadette. I knew that there was serious potential, and if it was what God wanted, then I was gonna go for it.
I think that this was about a couple weeks into dating where, while we were hanging out and we were talking about a bunch of different things, and one of the questions that I asked him, I said, "So,
Do you think that I can get you to heaven?" And it was an incredible question. I was, I kind of knew it because, I wanted to find myself a wife who had heaven in mind and thought about eternal things and looked after the good of, her soul and my soul above all things.
And he's like, "Yeah, I think so. Do you think that I could help you get to heaven?" And I was like, "Yeah, I think so. Yeah, knowing what I know about you so far. I mean, we're not far in yet, but I think that there's some good potential there, some good promise." I really, throughout most of our relationship, I was on just a hunt to do whatever God's will was. We were both praying daily rosaries every day. I was praying my rosary for Dan, and he was also praying for me at that time. Before I left for Italy, Dan actually asked my dad if he could marry me, and Dad said yes. So I was excited, of course. I was a little bit nervous though, and still making sure that I was doing whatever God wanted me to. So I dedicated the pilgrimage to clarity on that topic. Also, before I left, I promised Dan that I would buy him a rosary in Rome. He said I didn't have to. I said, "That's okay. I will." I went to the little rosary shop and I was looking for rosaries, and I had this moment of anxiety, and then I was like, you know what, it's like, even though like that moment was telling me that like I shouldn't buy the rosary, it's not gonna work out, whatever, I'm like, okay, I'm not gonna listen to that. I grabbed, the closest ones, and I was like, okay, what's on the center bead? Oh, it's Jesus. That's great. I'm just gonna buy two because then we could both have one. I bought them. They were all boxed. I looked at them in the hotel room that night, and the center bead wasn't just Jesus. It was Jesus with the Sacred Heart. That was a sign to me because the Feast of Sacred Heart was when we met. And I knew that I was going to get them blessed by the Pope the next day. So that really solidified that. And I was like, wow. So when I go home, I'm like, I just know I'm going home to my future husband. Yeah. So the engagement happened a couple of weeks after we came back.
It was a Tuesday. I knew they did adoration at St. Mary's, the same church that we met at.
We went to adoration. We did some time, and then I was like, okay, ready to go. So we were walking out, and once again he held the door open for me, and then we get out, and then he was on my right, and he just he goes down on one knee. And then he went down on the other knee because he felt it was more reverent.
And I wanted to make something kind of fitting, to play off of when we first met. I wanted to kind of play off of it in like a way of like conveying that now that I had come to know her.
I no longer have to rely on the good things people say about you because I've seen your goodness for myself. Will you marry me, be my wife? So I said yes. So not very long after getting engaged, my mom made a wedding rosary, and I got a prayer journal to pass around to our guests within the engagement period. We have the friends and family write down their prayer intentions in this journal and pray on this specific rosary. And when we got married, we had the rosary presented to Our Lady during the wedding procession. I
think that the rosary was very influential in bringing us together, and I thought it was only fitting to reciprocate that love that she showed us, to reciprocate it back to her, in consecrating our marriage to her.
The choir was singing, and we went up and we read from a paper from this consecration to Our Lady, that she would, help us through our journey together as a married couple.
Mary, obviously's intercession was very, very powerful, and I think that it was very important to our marriage. I credit, all the things in my life to Mary's intercession.